Kira Morrison was the new face at Crestwood Valley High, a ghost transplanted into a world that wasn't built for her. Her old neighborhood was a geography of sharp edges and loud noises, a place these students only knew from stories told in hushed, nervous tones. A place where you learned quickly that defiance could earn you a beating and vulnerability could get you broken. She carried the fight in her bones. But the predators here saw none of that. They saw only a quiet black girl, an easy mark for their thoughtless cruelties, and so they descended, their taunts growing sharper with each passing day. Then came the afternoon they brought scissors, their goal to finally shatter her composure. A wave of laughter crested and broke. Someone insisted it was merely a prank. The teacher turned a blind eye. The classroom fell into a charged silence, but something inside Kira refused to stay still. They had decided she was fragile. They had assumed she would simply endure it. They had made a profound miscalculation. The Monday sun was a harsh, glaring thing, bleaching the sky to a flat, uncaring shade of blue that made the entire town seem disinfected, artificial, as if every surface had been meticulously polished before the day began. Kira Morrison sat in the passenger seat of her mother's sedan, watching the procession of cookie-cutter houses drift by, each with its perfectly manicured lawn and gleaming SUV, all of them locked in a silent competition of suburban perfection. Her mother hadn't spoken much on the way, and Kira hadn't held her breath for it. Their lives had been a landscape of silence for months now. Dinners consumed without a word, doors clicking shut with a little too much finality, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. As the car eased into the school's sweeping front drive, the building rose before them, stark and imposing, banners proclaiming unity in achievement, flapping above the entrance. Kira's eyes lingered on those words, her jaw tight, her knuckles white against the worn leather of the door. Her mother fiddled with the rearview mirror, checking her lipstick, and breathed a half-formed phrase that sounded like, "You'll be fine." There was no embrace, no wish of good luck, not even a real glance in her direction. Just a perfunctory nod toward the school and the faint, impatient drumming of nails on the steering wheel, her mind already on the day's errands. Kira slipped out of the car without a word, the door closing with a soft whoosh behind her. For a heartbeat, she simply stood there, watching the river of students flowing through the main doors. Backpacks hung from their shoulders with practiced indifference. Phone screens cast a pale glow on their faces, and their laughter echoed with the easy confidence of people who had shared the same hallways since childhood. Not a single person looked at her, and yet she felt the pressure of their peripheral vision, the invisible ripple of whispers that moved through the air, even in their absence. She squared her shoulders, adjusted the strap of her own backpack, lifted her chin, and strode through the entrance as if none of it touched her. The first thing she registered was the smell. It was clean, but not the industrial bleach and metal scent she knew. This was a gentle, lemon-infused air that felt engineered. The corridors were expansive, the lockers a uniform shade of deep cobalt, and the floors were buffed to such a high gloss they mirrored the ceiling panels above. This place was another planet. It was silent where it should have been loud, loud where it should have been quiet, and designed like a labyrinth for which everyone but her had the map. Her homeroom teacher, a woman named Ms. Albright, with a smile stretched too thin to be genuine, welcomed her with a voice dipped in manufactured sweetness. "Welcome, Kira. We're so glad to have such a resilient student joining us." It was the way she emphasized resilient, the subtle pressure on the word, that made Kira want to turn and walk right back out. She claimed her assigned seat in the far corner without a word, her focus locked on the blank notebook before her as the muffled chatter of other students swirled around her. The first few hours of the day dissolved into a blur. Teachers recited their syllabi, and classmates observed her with the detached curiosity of zoogoers watching a new exhibit. When the lunch bell rang, Kira navigated the cafeteria with her tray held like a shield, crossing what felt like hostile, open territory. The tables were already occupied by tight-knit groups, jokes and stories, zipping between people who moved with an unconscious sense of belonging. She saw an unoccupied spot at the edge of the room and headed for it, only to have someone slide into the chair a moment before she arrived. There was no apology, just a look that held for a second too long. She changed course, finally finding a solitary seat by the exit, and ate in a bubble of silence. It was there she truly saw them for the first time. Ethan Croft and his two loyal shadows, Liam and Nate. They moved with an inherited swagger, the kind of easy dominance that comes from generations of being told, "The world belongs to you." Their eyes swept the cafeteria as if they were choosing the day's entertainment. And when Ethan's gaze settled on Kira, a flicker of something passed through them. It wasn't the look of, "I know you," but rather, "I've cataloged your type." A thin, cruel smile touched his lips, and he nudged Nate, who let out a soft, appreciative whistle as they leaned in together, sharing some unspoken joke at her expense. She didn't look down. She didn't offer a smile. She just held their gaze, her expression a blank, unyielding wall, until they finally moved on. The next day the campaign began, starting with small, deniable aggressions. A shoulder checked against hers in the hallway, harder than was necessary. A pencil casually swept from her desk. A snicker that was just a little too loud. A name whispered just under the breath. "Hood rat! She's got a temper. Thinks she's something." Kira said nothing. She kept her hands laced in her lap, her eyes fixed on the clock, her mind falling back into the familiar cadence of muscle and instinct. How to brace her core, how to shift her weight, how to listen for the sound of approaching feet. She had sworn to herself there would be no fights. Not in this place, not this time. But there was a slow, creeping poison in the air, something that told her this would not end. Not until she made it end. There was a palpable shift in the school's atmosphere that second week. It was as if the very walls had come to a silent consensus that Kira Morrison was an anomaly, and they had no intention of making her feel welcome. The smile she received grew more strained, the staircases seemed to stretch longer, and the air itself felt different, as though it were filtered to constantly remind her that she was an outsider. It didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It never does. But the message was being constructed piece by piece, silent yet deafening. "You are not one of us." In chemistry, after she correctly answered a complex question, a snort came from behind her, followed by a whisper that carried perfectly. Must have learned that at the School of Hard Knocks. Kira's hand paused for a fraction of a second over her paper before she resumed writing. She refused to turn around. Liam, the one who'd said it, leaned toward Nate, chuckling. "Straight out of the ghetto, solving for X." Nate snickered back. Man, she probably traded her food stamps for a calculator. Kira heard every syllable, but her expression remained a mask of stone. She had learned long ago that a well-held silence could be a heavier weapon than any curse. She tapped her pencil against the desk once, twice, the same way she used to tap her knuckles against a brick wall before Marco taught her to wrap them properly. 1 to 2, the cold detachment only seemed to embolden them. By gym class, their game had grown more physical. During a heated basketball scrimmage, Liam barreled past her for a rebound, his shoulder connecting with enough force to send her stumbling. "Watch yourself, Serena," he sneered as he jogged away. Kira regained her balance without falling, straightening up with deliberate slowness. She looked him directly in the eye. "That's not even original," she said, her voice quiet, controlled, not angry, but utterly dismissive. Liam stopped, blinking. "What?" "You're not clever," she added, turning away from him. "You're just loud." It was the first time she had spoken back, and her words hung in the air, sharp as shattered glass. For a moment Liam was frozen, a half-formed smirk dying on his face. Behind him Nate let out a theatrical "Ooh," while Ethan, who was always observing from a safe distance, tilted his head from the bleachers, a curious smile playing on his lips. He wasn't laughing. He was watching Kira as if she had just revealed a fascinating new quality. After class, as she headed to her locker, Ethan fell into step beside her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You've got a sharp tongue," he remarked casually. Kira kept walking, her pace unchanged. "And you've got a lot of noise coming out of yours." He let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Ah, I get it." The new girl, trying to establish her territory. "I'm not trying," she stated, her gaze fixed straight ahead. "And I'm not new. I'm just here." Ethan clicked his tongue. "Here from where?" She didn't grant him an answer. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I bet it was nothing like this place." This time she stopped and turned to him. Her gaze was direct, unflinching, sharp as a razor's edge. "You have no idea." Ethan's smile faltered for an instant, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Then he recovered, stepping back with a short laugh, holding his hands up in mock surrender. "All right, tough girl, let's see how long that act lasts." The next morning she swung open her locker and found it crammed with wads of torn paper, scraps of old sales flyers, and ripped pages from a notebook. At first it looked like random trash, but as she began to pull it out, she saw the words scrawled in thick black marker across the jagged edges. "Go home. We don't want your kind here." She stood perfectly still, the pieces of paper fluttering down to her feet. A few students walking by saw, but none of them paused. One girl met her eyes for a second before quickly looking away. Another student let out a stifled giggle and hurried past. Kira crouched, gathered the paper in her hand, shoved it deep into her backpack, and closed the locker door with a soft, final click. She wouldn't report it, not this. But someone else had been watching. Later that afternoon, as she stood waiting for her bus near the stone columns by the entrance, a voice cut through the noise. It wasn't harsh or accusatory, just calm and steady. "Are you holding up okay?" She turned to find Principal Ramsey. He was a tall, well-dressed man, his skin the same deep shade as her father's, with eyes that looked like they held entire libraries of stories. He carried himself with a quiet authority, the way a person does when they've learned the profound difference between speaking and letting the silence do the work. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I'm fine." His gaze lingered on her for a moment. "Are you sure? You're not exactly blending in." "I never said I was trying to," she replied. He offered a faint smile. "No, you didn't. But I recognize that expression." She arched an eyebrow. "What expression is that?" "The one that says, 'I know precisely how far I can be pushed before the person doing the pushing learns they chose the wrong target.'" A tiny twitch at the corner of Kira's mouth was her only response. "That's very specific." "I've been doing this a while," he said simply. "And I'm not new here either." She truly looked at him then, this man who wore his calm like armor, who wasn't offering her pity or platitudes, but something far more valuable. Respect. She nodded once. "If they cross a line," he said, his voice lowering slightly, "and you decide you want it on the record, you come to me. I will handle it the right way." "What's the right way?" "The way they never see coming." As the bus pulled up to the curb, Kira gave him a final look. "Thank you," he stepped back, nodding. "Any time, Ms. Morrison." She boarded the bus and sank into a seat by the window, the day's weight settling on her shoulders like a damp cloak. She could feel it now, a cold current rising under her skin. It wasn't fear and it wasn't pain. It was something older, something harder. They thought she would just keep absorbing their hate, but they hadn't taken anything from her. Not anything that mattered, not yet. It happened on a Wednesday, during that sluggish part of the week when the school's energy seemed to sag, as if time itself were weary. The sky was a blanket of oppressive gray, and the hallways felt unnaturally still, the air thick and stagnant. Kira felt the shift the second she walked into the building. It was an unspoken tension, something that clung to her like a second skin, tight and heavy. She noticed their eyes on her all morning. First, in the hallway, where Ethan Croft lounged against a locker, as if waiting for a show, his thumbs moving over his phone screen, his gaze flicking to her just long enough to be an announcement. Then, in third period, Nate kept half-turning in his seat to whisper to Liam, the two of them sharing smirks like conspirators who already knew the punchline. Their laughter was quiet, but it was aimed. By fourth period, Kira was cataloging the ways they were tightening their circle without making contact. A whisper that started just as she passed, a burst of laughter that erupted a second too late, heads turning to watch her before quickly looking away. There were no insults this time, no shoves, just the unnerving pressure of being watched, of being measured. The only warning was the silence that preceded the act. The final move came during sixth period art class. It was a free-form session. Students were scattered around the room with various materials, sketchbooks, paints, glue, and the standard-issue school scissors with blades just dull enough to appear safe. The teacher, Ms. Gable, was occupied in a corner discussing a portfolio with another student. The rest of the class was lost in soft chatter or the idle doodling that signals a focus more on the clock than on the art. Kira was seated toward the back, angled to face a window, her pencil sketching idle, flowing lines on a blank page. She was not drawing anything specific. It was just the motion, the act of keeping her hands busy. She never saw Nate move up behind her. She never heard the snip of the blades. It was over so quickly she didn't process what had happened until it was already done. There was the faint metallic whisper of scissors, opening and closing, the soft slicing sound, and then a sharp, sudden tug at her scalp that made her entire body go rigid. Not from pain, but from pure, cold instinct. She lifted a hand to the back of her head, her fingers finding only frayed, severed ends. Her braid, one of the thick, intricate braids she'd spent hours weaving, was gone. The severed strands lay limp in her palm, the blunt edge brushing against her skin as if it, too, was confused. Behind her, Nate was cackling. "Oh, man, I can't believe you did it." Liam gasped from his table, his voice a mix of shock and glee. "Dude, that's twisted." Nate held the severed braid up like a war prize, dangling it back and forth. "Just thought she could use a little less weight. That stuff looks heavy, right?" Kira didn't turn. She just stared at the piece of her hair in her own hand, her body still. Ethan's voice cut through the noise from across the room, pitched just loud enough for performance. "Damn, I didn't think you had it in you. Bold move? Think she's gonna cry?" The laughter spread, punctuated by soft gasps and shocked whispers, the sounds that transform cruelty into a spectator sport. Kira remained motionless. She wasn't looking at the hair anymore, but through it, her gaze fixed on something distant, her body so still and quiet it made the surrounding laughter feel shrill and violent. Nate leaned in close again, his voice a taunting whisper near her ear. "Hey, don't get all bent out of shape. It's just a joke. You're always so wound up. Thought you needed a new look." That's when she rose to her feet. The sound of her chair scraping against the linoleum was loud enough to cut through the room's cruel rhythm. She didn't yell. She didn't cry out. She simply stood, turned to face him, and looked from his eyes down to the braid he was still holding. Nate blinked, his bravado wavering. "Chill out," he stammered, suddenly uncertain. "It's not like it's your real hair or anything." Kira's eyes locked onto his, her expression a blank, unreadable slate. "You think that matters?" Liam stepped forward, trying to recapture their momentum. "Look, nobody was trying to start anything. It's just hair, for God's sake." Ethan, still lounging nearby, leaned back and folded his arms. "I mean, you make it a statement piece. You wear it like it's armor. People are bound to test it. That's just the way things are." Kira's gaze shifted to him now, her voice dangerously calm. "You think this is about my hair?" Ethan smirked. "Isn't it?" She took a single, deliberate step forward, and then another. The silence in the room grew thicker with each move she made. Nate wasn't laughing anymore. His hand had dropped, and the braid fell to the floor. Ms. Gable finally looked up from her conversation, her expression shifting into slow-motion confusion. "Is there a problem over here?" No one bothered to answer her. Kira's voice, when it came, was low and resonant. "You don't get to touch me. You don't get to take a piece of me and call it a joke." Nate held up his hands. Okay. Just take it easy." But Kira wasn't angry, not in the way they understood anger. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't dissolving into the puddle of tears they must have envisioned when they planned this, laughing over a group chat, certain she would flee the room in humiliation. She was quiet, controlled, and watching. And as she took one more slow step toward Nate, his smirk finally collapsed, his voice hitched, and the realization dawned on his face that this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. For a stretched-out moment, the entire room seemed to have forgotten the mechanics of breathing. The severed braid lay on the floor, a dark curl on the pale linoleum, like a question nobody wanted to answer. Ms. Gable remained frozen by her desk, her eyes darting between the students, trying to assemble the narrative of what she had missed, but not moving, not stepping in. Not yet. Kira was the calm at the center of the storm. Her hands at her sides, her posture erect. Her head angled slightly toward Nate, who was now inching backward, as if creating distance could somehow undo his actions. But she was no longer advancing on him. She was calculating. The echo of her cousin's voice resonated deep in her mind. Never throw the first punch unless you have to, but when you do, make it fast and final. She could still feel the phantom sting on her scalp where the braid had been cut, a hot pulse of violation against her skin. She didn't touch the spot again. She didn't have to. The damage had been publicly done. Liam muttered something, trying to pull Nate back. "Dude, just walk away." She's losing it, but Nate was paralyzed. Ethan remained leaning against a far table, his arms still crossed, but his eyes were sharp now. The amusement was gone, replaced by a kind of detached curiosity, the look of someone who has miscalculated a variable and is now watching to see how badly the experiment will fail. At last Kira moved, her steps slow and deliberate, her gaze locked on Nate. He raised a hand as if to placate her. "Look, I said I was sorry, okay? It was just hair. It's not like we—" Her fist connected before he could finish the sentence. There was no warning, no wind-up, just a sudden, brutal pivot of her body and a clean, powerful right hook that crashed against his cheekbone. The sound was sharp and sickening, a crack of cartilage followed by the heavy thud of his body slamming into the art supply table behind him. The table bucked, paint jars skittered across the surface, and students gasped as Nate slid to the floor, stunned and crumpled, his hands flying to his face as blood began to stream from his nose. Ms. Gable let out a shriek, but Kira had already pivoted. Liam lunged at her and she sidestepped, grabbing his outstretched arm, twisting his wrist, and slamming his elbow down hard across the table's edge. He screamed, a high, thin sound, and collapsed, clutching his arm to his chest as tears of pain flooded his eyes. Ethan moved next, not to join the fight, but to put himself between them, his hands raised. Okay, that's enough. You made your point. You win." Kira's eyes didn't even flicker. "No," she said, her voice colder than ice. "You don't get to speak." Ethan's mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. He took a careful step back, his hands still up, but his face had changed. The arrogance had vanished. In its place was a stark recognition, laced with something that looked a lot like fear. A cluster of students scrambled toward the door. Some watched, wide-eyed. Others were fumbling for their phones, trying to record, caught between the urge to hide and the urge to witness. Ms. Gable finally broke from her paralysis, lunging for the intercom on her desk, her voice cracking as she yelled, "We need security in room 316. Security to Art now." Kira stood amidst the chaos. Spilled paint, overturned chairs, scattered papers. She wasn't breathing heavily. Her face wasn't flushed. She was utterly still. Her gaze swept the room one last time, then fell to the braid on the floor. She bent down, picked it up, and held it in her hand like something precious. Then she turned and walked out. She didn't run. She didn't speak. She moved calmly through the doorway and into the empty hall, the sound of her footsteps echoing with a steady rhythm that seemed impossible for what had just occurred. She could hear the storm erupting behind her, shouting students, pounding feet, Ms. Gable's voice, shrill with panic. But Kira kept walking. She moved down the corridor as if she already knew her destination, already knew the accusations they would level, already knew that none of it mattered anymore. By the time the assistant principal and 2 campus security officers rounded the corner, she was waiting for them. She stood quietly by the stairwell, her hands behind her back, the severed braid hanging from her fingers. They yelled at her to stop. She didn't flinch. They hurried toward her, their voices raised. But it was unnecessary. She offered no resistance as they flanked her. She made no protest as they escorted her toward the main office. She said nothing as they peppered her with questions. She just kept her eyes forward, her jaw set, her silence a heavy, unbreachable wall. By the time they reached the front office, the news had already outrun them. Students lined the walls, pretending to read posters, their ears straining toward the principal's door. Someone whispered her name. Someone else muttered, "She finally snapped." A third voice said, "They cut her hair." And that phrase, more than anything, sent a ripple of static through the crowd. Inside the principal's office, Elias Ramsey stood waiting. He didn't seem surprised when they brought her in. He was tall and solid, his presence a quiet anchor, dressed in dark trousers and a crisp button-up, sleeves rolled to the elbows. He dismissed the security officers with a single sharp nod. "Close the door," he said. They paused. "She's not a flight risk? You can close it." The door clicked shut, sealing them in. Principal Ramsey observed her for a long moment, then motioned to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit down, Kira." She did. The office was an island of quiet, insulated from the chaos in the hall, the door shut with a sense of purpose, not mere privacy. Kira sat stiffly in the chair, the severed braid still clutched in her hand, her fingers wrapped around it, as if she couldn't decide whether it was something to be protected or mourned. The room had the faint, comforting scent of coffee and paper. Through the window she could see students loitering in the hallway, their attempts to look casual failing completely. Principal Ramsey ignored them. His attention was fixed on her, his elbows on the desk, his hands clasped. He sat not with tension, but with deliberation, the posture of a man who understands that the words spoken in this room will carry more weight than everything that came before. "I've read the preliminary report from the art teacher," he said, his voice even and low. "It says you assaulted 3 students. One has a suspected broken nose. The other is on his way for x-rays." Kira's eyes dropped to the floor, not out of shame, but as if gathering her thoughts. She was calm, measured, bracing for the inevitable fallout. "Let me ask you something else," Ramsey continued, leaning forward. "Why?" Kira's voice, when it came, was softer now, tinged with exhaustion, more than rage. "They cut my hair." He nodded, not in surprise, as if the words didn't startle him, but merely confirmed a deep, unspoken suspicion. He let the silence hang in the air for another moment, studying her with a patience that felt nothing like judgment. "I suspected as much," he said at last. "I saw the security footage from the hallway after you left the classroom. You weren't running. You weren't hiding. You were waiting. That isn't the behavior of someone who just lost control." Her eyes met his then, a flicker of curiosity in them. She hadn't anticipated this. Not from a man in a pressed shirt who could have already buried her under a mountain of disciplinary codes and official jargon. "Most people," he went on, "when they hear that a black girl fought 3 white boys and sent 2 of them to the nurse's office, they jump to one conclusion: violence, rage, a threat." "I know," she said, her voice flat. "They always do. But when I hear it," he said, his voice dropping, slowing, "I start asking what happened before the fists flew. I ask what wasn't on camera, what was dismissed as a joke, what the adults in the room failed to see or chose to ignore. And most of the time," he let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening, "nobody wants to hear the answers to those questions." Kira leaned back in her chair, still holding the braid. "I didn't come here to fight," she said after a moment. "I just wanted to get through the day, go home, just breathe." "Then why didn't you just walk away?" She looked at him then, her eyes dry, her mouth a tight line against the heat rising in her chest. "Because I have walked away 100 times. Because I have ignored the whispers, the shoves, the so-called accidents. Because I sat there and I took it, and every time I did, they just pushed harder, laughed louder, got more confident." She opened her hand, revealing the frayed, brutalized end of the braid. "And then they took this." Principal Ramsey looked at the braid, his expression unreadable. "It was never just about hair." "No," she said. "It never is." There was a long silence. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled once more, and then spoke with a quiet intensity that was more powerful than any shout. "My grandmother used to braid my sister's hair on our porch every Sunday morning. She called it her crown. She said the world would always try to snatch it one way or another, through rules, through stares, through silence. But if you wore it with dignity, if you knew its worth, then no one could take it from you without a fight." Kira didn't smile, but a knot of tension in her shoulders began to loosen. "I have to suspend you," he said, his voice steady again. 3 days. That's the rule." "I figured," she replied. "But I am not expelling you," he added firmly. "They are going to demand it. The parents, the school board, maybe the whole district. They will call you a danger. They will say you need to be removed." Kira's lips pressed into a thin line. "And when they do," he said, "I am going to request the security footage from inside that art room. I am going to write my own report. I am going to start asking the questions that make powerful people very, very uncomfortable. She watched him, her expression searching. Why? Because, he said slowly, for my entire career, I have walked the line between doing the job they expect of me and doing the job that needs to be done. And today I decided those two things no longer have to be separate. He opened a drawer, pulled out a simple manila envelope, and slid it across the desk. This is your suspension notice. You'll sign it, I'll file it, and you'll go home. She took the envelope but didn't open it. But this is not the end of the story, he said. Do you understand me? She gave a single slow nod. You have been fighting this battle by yourself since the day you got here, he said. You don't have to anymore. Her grip on the braid loosened, just slightly, as if a part of her was finally starting to believe him. And for the first time since entering that room, she spoke a word that sounded almost like hope. Okay. The morning after the fight, the school's parking lot began to fill much earlier than usual. The sky was still a pale pre-dawn gray when the first black SUV pulled up, followed swiftly by a silver sedan and a gleaming white luxury car with windows so dark they seemed to swallow the light. They arrived in a quiet, formidable wave, the parents dressed in sharp business attire that spoke of money and influence. They were the kind of people who didn't come to ask questions. They came to demand answers, apologies, and immediate action. Principal Ramsey stood by the tall windows near the main entrance, watching the storm clouds gather. He didn't rush. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his composure a stark contrast to the frantic voice of the receptionist buzzing through the intercom. They're all here, sir. Should I call the district mediator? Do you need a representative from the board? He pressed the button, his voice perfectly calm. No, send them to the conference room. I'll be right there. When he entered the room, they were all standing, a united front of 3 fathers and 3 mothers. Expensive coats were draped over the backs of chairs, and polished watches gleamed under the recessed lighting. They looked at him with the cool appraisal of executives who have already decided an employee is obsolete. One of the mothers, a woman in a tailored red blazer with a severe haircut, had her arms crossed, her lips a bloodless line. Her eyes zeroed in on him. You're Principal Ramsey, she stated. It was not a question. I am, he replied with a nod. They remained standing, so he did as well. The silence stretched, thick with accusation, until the tallest of the men, a man with broad shoulders in a custom suit, stepped forward. Let's dispense with the formalities, he said, his voice low and gravelly. My son has a broken nose and 2 black eyes. I want you to explain why the girl who assaulted him isn't in police custody. She has been suspended, Ramsey answered, his tone even. 3 days, which is the standard protocol for a physical altercation of this nature. That was not an altercation, the woman in red snapped. That was a vicious, unprovoked attack. No, Ramsey said calmly. It was a response. A palpable tension filled the room. Excuse me. Another father said, Nate's, Ramsey presumed. Are you defending her? I am stating the facts, Ramsey replied, his voice firm. Your sons cornered a student in her classroom, used a pair of scissors to cut off her hair without her permission, and then proceeded to mock and humiliate her in front of her peers. That is assault. That is degradation. That is a profound act of emotional violence, and it elicited a physical response. You have no idea what you are talking about, the woman hissed. You are trying to build a narrative that justifies violence against our children. No, Ramsey said, his voice sharpening just a fraction. I am trying to build a narrative that aligns with the truth. One of the men moved closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, far more menacing than a shout. We have been very generous to this school. I sit on the district board. My law firm is a primary sponsor for your sports programs. And now you're telling me my son is supposed to feel unsafe here because you are coddling some girl with an axe to grind. I am allowing her to attend the school where she is legally enrolled, where she has a right to an education, and where she should have been safe from the moment she walked through our doors, Ramsey interrupted, his voice cutting through the man's entitlement like a surgeon's blade. You are not angry because your sons were hurt. You were angry because for the first time in their lives, someone fought back, and you were completely unprepared for what that would look like. The silence that followed was charged, vibrating with the barely contained fury of people unaccustomed to being contradicted. One of the mothers shook her head slowly, her voice cold with the certainty of her own power. "You understand that this is not over, don't you? We will not let this stand. Not after what she did. The media will hear about this." "I'm counting on it," Ramsey said simply. They all stared at him, confused. He walked around the conference table, his movements slow and deliberate, his voice softening, just enough to make them listen more closely. Because as soon as the media hears about it, they will also get a copy of the security footage from inside that classroom. The footage of 3 boys surrounding one girl, cutting her hair, laughing at her. And once the public sees that video, I am willing to bet they will have a very clear understanding of why that young woman chose to defend herself. And if the media isn't interested, I'm sure the courts will be. "You wouldn't dare," one of them growled. "I already have," he replied. The video is in the hands of the district superintendent as we speak. So if you are here to lodge a formal complaint, by all means, do so. I will add it to the growing file. But if you are here to threaten me, you are wasting both my time and yours. One of the fathers jabbed a finger in his direction. "You will lose your job for this." Ramsey allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. "If I do, it will be for doing the right thing." They had no response to that, not with words. They gathered their belongings in a stiff, angry silence, their movements jerky with the frustration of a battle they had unexpectedly lost. The mother in red paused at the door, glancing back at him. "You have made a grave error." Ramsey looked at her, his expression calm and resolute. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I've made a choice." The tension did not dissipate after the parents left. It merely changed its form. They had departed without achieving their objective, but their assault was far from over. The emails began that afternoon, a flurry of digital missives CC'd to the superintendent and every board member, filled with loaded phrases like campus safety concerns and upholding district integrity. Rumors of lawsuits began to circulate, whispers of major donors pulling their funding, and official warnings trickled down through the administrative hierarchy about the optics of the situation. Principal Ramsey read every single one, his focus sharp and analytical. He printed them, filed them, and time-stamped them. He replied only when absolutely necessary, his responses brief, professional, and always accompanied by a link to the time-stamped video evidence of what had truly transpired in that classroom. The footage itself wasn't gory. It contained no blood, no punches. It showed something far more insidious. Ethan Croft leaning back with a self-satisfied smirk, Nate looming behind Kira with scissors in hand, and the casual, cruel moment her braid was stolen from her as if it were nothing. Ramsey never raised his voice. He never postured. He simply documented, and while he built his case, Kira watched. She returned to school after her 3-day suspension, walking through the main entrance with her head held high, her expression unreadable. The whispers trailed her like a phantom, twisting between lockers and rising from clusters of students who were not brave enough to speak to her face. Some stared, some looked away, and a few watched with a kind of fearful admiration, as if they couldn't decide if she was a danger or a hero. She navigated the day with almost no direct interaction. Teachers seemed to avoid making eye contact. No one called on her to answer questions. The air around her was different now, heavy and charged, a silent warning that kept most people at a distance. But what she carried was not fear. It was control. That afternoon, Principal Ramsey summoned her to his office. There was no disciplinary slip, no formal reprimand, just a quiet note delivered by a guidance counselor. "He would like to speak with you when you have a moment." She found him surrounded by binders and stacks of paper, his desk a chaotic landscape of printouts and security logs. He gestured for her to shut the door. "Are you doing okay out there?" he asked, not looking up. She gave a small shrug. "I'm used to being watched." He nodded, straightening up. "Good, because they haven't stopped." He motioned for her to sit and slid a single folder across the desk. Inside were still images, screenshots from the security cameras. One showed Nate standing behind her. Another, a clearer shot, captured the scissors just before the cut. No violence, no blood. Just cold, hard evidence. I've sent these to the superintendent, he said, and I am compiling a formal report for the state board. It won't go far if it's just my word. But if it reveals a pattern— What pattern? She asked, her eyes sharp. Ramsey opened a drawer and produced a thin, spiral-bound notebook, sliding it toward her. Inside were 3 names she recognized, all students of color, all quiet, all recent transfers. Beside each name was a short, damning note. Grade slipped. Locker defaced. Complaint ignored. Warning issued for disruptive behavior. I started this last semester, he said. This isn't just about you. It's been happening for a long time, always just small enough, just quiet enough to be swept under the rug. Kira stared at the names, her mind connecting the dots. They didn't speak up. Some did, Ramsey corrected. They were dismissed, told they were being too sensitive, told not everything is about race. Kira looked up at him. But it is. Exactly, he said. She sat back, her fingers resting on the notebook. What do you need me to do? I need you to watch, he said carefully. If you see something, write it down. Names, times, teachers who look the other way, students who push the boundaries. Document it all, but do not engage unless it is absolutely necessary. You think they'll try something again? I know they will, he said, but they'll be smarter this time. They'll use the rules against you. A dress code violation, a claim of aggressive language, anything they can twist to make you seem like the problem. Kira let out a slow breath. So I'm the bait? No, Ramsey said, his voice calm but firm. You are the leverage. He leaned forward, his hands folded. They underestimated you. That was their first mistake. Their second was believing you were alone. She met his gaze, her eyes narrowing. And what if I do this and nothing changes? Then we get louder, he said. But first, we make it undeniable. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. And that is how it started. Not with a protest or a news story, but with a quiet notebook passed between 2 people who knew the system too well to ever truly trust it. Kira kept it at the bottom of her backpack, hidden beneath textbooks, a weapon she was learning how to wield. In the weeks that followed, she watched. She listened. She wrote. It did not take long for the carefully constructed calm of the school to begin to show its cracks. They were not dramatic fissures, but quiet hairline fractures, the kind that don't make noise but spread insidiously beneath the surface. A week after Kira's return, the morning announcements included a hastily added reminder about respectful discourse and appropriate self-expression. The language was so generic it could have meant anything, but its timing made the target obvious. Students exchanged knowing glances. Some rolled their eyes. Others shot looks toward her desk, as if she were a question they didn't know how to answer. Kira showed no reaction. She had learned to let the first tremor pass. It was never about the initial shock. It was about the aftershocks that followed. In the second week, she saw it happen to someone else. A small Latina girl pushed hard in the hallway by a boy twice her size. His laughter was careless, his mockery cloaked in the guise of playfulness. When the girl turned to snap back at him, a teacher materialized just in time to reprimand her for her tone. Kira noted the time, the names, and the teacher's deliberate blindness. She did not step in, not yet. At lunch, she started to see the patterns of how certain students moved in orbits. The same groups, the same sideways glances when she walked into the cafeteria. Liam was back, his arm in a sling, his demeanor quieter, but he was still flanked by Nate and 2 others who hadn't been there before. Their pack had changed its configuration, but not its intent. They never spoke to her. They didn't have to. The message was in their posture, in the way conversations would halt as she passed, in the way laughter would die just a little too quickly. She felt the circle tightening. At the same time, Principal Ramsey was moving with a new kind of energy. He was still the picture of composure, but there was an undercurrent of urgency to his actions. His meetings with school counselors became longer, and late-night emails to district officials now contained phrases like a demonstrable pattern of misconduct and systemic administrative negligence. He never copied Kira on his correspondence, but she knew. She could see the shift in the way he observed the hallways, his gaze slower, more methodical. One evening, he called her to his office after the building had mostly emptied. The setting sun cast long amber shadows across the room, and the front desk was dark. He didn't ask her to sit. He stood by the window, his arms crossed, and nodded toward the door. "Lock it," he said softly. She did without question. He turned and pointed to a small folder on his desk. "Someone slipped this under my door, anonymously." It was an internal staff email thread, forwarded from a teacher's account. Kira opened the folder and read. The language was carefully coded, but the meaning was brutally clear. Teachers were discussing discipline issues tied to students from less supportive home environments. Another email referenced the challenges of dealing with certain cultural influences. No names were mentioned, but the implication was a suffocating blanket. She read one line aloud, her voice cold and flat. "Some of these kids come here looking for a fight. They need discipline, not coddling." Principal Ramsey leaned against his desk. "That's from a teacher on your third period rotation, the same one who ignored the first incident with Nate." She let the paper drift back onto the desk. "They're trying to build a case against me," he nodded once. "Not just you. Against anything that disrupts their idea of order. Even if it's the truth." "Especially if it's the truth," she corrected. Her jaw was tight. "So what happens now?" "We watch for the fractures," he said. "And when one appears, we drive in the wedge." The wedge appeared sooner than either of them had anticipated. 2 days later, one of the school janitors, a quiet black man named Marcus who rarely spoke to anyone, stopped Kira in an empty hallway as the final bell rang. His voice was low, his eyes darting around nervously. "I saw what happened in the art room that day," he said quickly. "I was up on a ladder, changing a bulb by the door. Nobody even saw me." Kira stared at him. "Why are you telling me this now?" He hesitated. "Because I've seen it happen before. Not the scissors, but what comes after. The way they twist the story. The way it destroys people." She nodded slowly. "Would you be willing to say that to someone who matters?" His eyes flicked down the hall again. If the right person asked. When she relayed the conversation to Principal Ramsey, his expression remained unchanged. He only murmured, "That's the beginning." Another fracture emerged in a staff meeting when a young, idealistic English teacher, Miss Cole, asked why no students had been formally interviewed by the district before they issued their initial statement on the fight. Her voice shook slightly, but the question landed with the force of a thunderclap in the silent room. No one answered her. The following day, she discovered she had been removed from the curriculum development committee she had served on all year. Kira wrote that down too. She recorded everything. She watched the system bend and contort around her, watched as teachers avoided her gaze, watched as students quietly chose their sides without speaking a single word. She was no longer a mystery. She was a test. And it was a test that no one wanted to fail. It started again during lunch because of course it did. It was always in the spaces where adults looked but did not see, where a quiet room was mistaken for a peaceful one. Kira was sitting alone, as she always did, her back to a large window at the far end of the cafeteria. It was a spot she preferred, half in shadow, a place from which she could observe the room without being the center of it. But today she could feel the change before she saw it. The subtle shift in the room's acoustics, the way the voices behind her grew just a fraction louder. The familiar sneering cadence of Nate's laugh, Liam's mock whispers, and Ethan's voice, always measured, always performing for an unseen crowd. They hadn't made a move in weeks, but she should have known they weren't finished. She kept her head down. It began with small things. A stray grape rolled across her table. A moment later, a crumpled napkin landed beside her tray. She didn't react. She didn't look up. Her pen moved with a steady, unhurried rhythm across a blank page in her notebook, cataloging each small act of aggression as it occurred. 11:38 a.m. Grape rolled from northwest table. 11:40 a.m. Napkin thrown by Liam, followed by laughter. 11:42 a.m. Nate mimicking her posture, using a mocking tone under his breath. 11:43 a.m. Ethan speaking loudly, glancing over to check for a reaction. And then 11:44 a.m. Plastic fork hits tray. "Why don't you ever smile?" From Ethan. That's when she lifted her head, slowly, calmly. Her eyes met Ethan's, and for a split second he froze, his performance faltering. She didn't speak. She didn't glare. She simply held his gaze, an unblinking pillar of stillness, until he was the one who looked away, coughing and turning back to his friends as if he hadn't just lost a battle he didn't even know he was fighting. She didn't have to fight them with her fists anymore. She just had to watch them unravel in real time. She stood, picked up her tray, and walked past their table without increasing her pace, without offering a single word. As she passed, Liam muttered, "Psycho bitch!" But she was already moving, walking with a calm, deliberate purpose straight toward the main office. The rage in her chest was a tightly wound spring, burning hot but producing no smoke. She asked to see Principal Ramsey. The secretary hesitated, saying he was in a meeting. Perhaps she could leave a message. "No," Kira said evenly. "I'll wait." She stood in the corner of the waiting area, near a glass case filled with dusty trophies, perfectly still. Her expression was a blank slate. It took 15 minutes. She didn't fidget once. When Ramsey emerged from his office, his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, he saw her immediately and raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" "Yes," she said. He held the door open without another question. "Come in." Inside, she placed her notebook on his desk and slid it toward him. "The last page." He read in silence, his head nodding slightly as his eyes scanned each line. "They're starting again," she said quietly. "Testing the waters, seeing how much they can get away with now that things have cooled down." "Did anyone else see this?" She nodded. "A few students. One teacher was nearby, but she was looking at her phone." Ramsey flipped the page and saw a small, precise note in the corner. "Camera, northeast corner. Line of sight partially blocked by pillar." He looked up, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "You mapped the blind spots." Kira's voice was steady. "You said to make it undeniable." His lips twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. "You were listening." "They don't think anyone is watching," she said. "They think no one cares." "Most people don't," he replied. "Not until it affects them personally." He took out his phone, typed a quick message, and then looked back at her. "I'm requesting the full unedited cafeteria footage from the district IT department before anyone has a chance to touch it. But we're going to need more than that. We need witness statements." "They won't talk," she said. "Not unless someone else goes first." "Are you volunteering?" he asked. Kira met his gaze without hesitation. "I'll go first." There was a pause, a moment heavy with the weight of her words. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, let's make it official." They wrote the report together, her notes providing a clean, detailed, and irrefutable timeline. Timestamps, names, direct quotes. His demeanor was calm as he typed, but his fingers moved with the steady, relentless rhythm of a man who was done playing by the old rules. When they were finished, he looked at her. "This is going to make a lot of people angry." "I'm not trying to be liked," she said. "You're trying to be heard," she nodded. He leaned back, folding his arms. "Then it's time we found you a microphone." It began quietly, as all true reckonings do. First with a tremor of uncertainty in places that were accustomed to absolute confidence. Then with voices that were not loud, but were impossible to ignore. After Kira filed her official statement, after Ramsey secured the raw video footage before it could be lost, a subtle but profound change began to ripple through the school. It was difficult to quantify at first, but Kira felt it in the way the administrative staff would fall silent when she walked by, in the way certain teachers would hesitate before calling on her in class. No one said a word directly. They didn't have to. The fear was no longer about what she had done, but what she might do next. The principal, meanwhile, operated with a deliberate calm that belied the storm he was orchestrating beneath the surface. His meetings with district officials grew more frequent, his emails more pointed. What none of them seemed to grasp, not yet, was that Ramsey wasn't trying to quell the unrest. He was waiting for the tide to come in. By the end of the week, the cafeteria footage had been officially logged and submitted alongside Kira's detailed report. On screen, the events unfolded without narration or bias. You could see her sitting alone, still as a statue, while the boys behind her laughed, threw things, and mimicked her. At 11:44 a.m., you could hear Ethan's voice clearly. "Why don't you ever smile?" It was followed by that long, heavy pause when she turned and simply stared at him. That moment of silent defiance was more powerful than any punch she could have thrown. When Ramsey submitted the file to the district, he included not just the video and Kira's testimony, but a cascade of other documents, photocopies of disciplinary records from the previous year, formal complaints filed by 3 other students against the same group of boys, all of which had been dismissed as unsubstantiated. It was a paper trail, meticulous and damning. A local journalist, a sharp young black woman named Zara Hayes, who had been covering the district's politics for years, picked up on the scent of the growing conflict. She reached out to Ramsey first, then to Kira, her questions careful and precise. She had seen too many stories like this collapse under the weight of sensationalism. What made this one different, she said, was the documentation, the video, the unassailable silence. She asked Kira for an interview. Kira agreed, but on her own terms. No television cameras, no dramatic lighting, just a quiet conversation, her voice, and the truth. They met in the school's media lab after hours, long after the last bell had rung and the hallways were empty. Ramsey waited outside, a quiet, supportive presence. When Kira sat down, her hands resting calmly in her lap, Zara pressed record and said, "Tell me only what you want the world to know." Kira wasn't nervous. She was tired but focused. She didn't dwell on the fight. She spoke about the feeling of being constantly watched, of being systematically mocked, of the moment she sat in a bathroom stall after her braid had been cut, staring at the severed pieces in her hand, and how the sound of laughter from the hallway wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to break the skin. She did not cry. Her voice did not tremble. She spoke with the profound weight of someone who had already endured the worst and was not asking for pity. When Zara asked what she hoped would happen now, she answered simply, "I want the truth to stop being a whisper." The interview was posted that weekend, embedded in a small article on the news outlet's website under the headline, "Student Speaks Out After Hair-Cutting Incident at Local High School." It didn't go viral, not in the explosive way of most online content, but it was clear and undeniable, and that clarity began to spread. By Monday, the school's phone lines were ringing, but the calls were different. Parents were asking questions. Was it true? Had there been other incidents? Why weren't their children being protected? That was when the first real cracks began to appear. A former teacher posted an anonymous comment on the article, confirming she had once reported Nate for harassing a Somali student and had been told to simply document it and move on. Another parent shared an old email exchange with a dean where concerns about racial tensions were brushed aside with the phrase, "We don't want to escalate the situation unnecessarily." Miss Cole, the English teacher who had spoken up in the staff meeting, shared the interview on her personal social media with a single, powerful sentence, "This is not new. This is just finally being seen." She was quietly placed on administrative leave the next week, the students noticed. By Wednesday, the superintendent announced a mandatory all-staff meeting at the school. By Friday, the school board had issued a public statement promising a third-party review of campus culture and disciplinary procedures. And through it all, Kira walked the hallways in exactly the same way she always had. Her shoulders back, her gaze level, saying nothing. She didn't need to speak anymore. Her silence had already done the work. Now it was everyone else's turn to explain themselves. By the end of the next week, the walls had begun to close in, not on Kira, but on the institution that had reflexively protected the boys. The school board's announcement of an independent investigation was front-page news in the local paper. The language was cautious, filled with phrases like a commitment to equity and reviewing our systems, but beneath the corporate jargon was the unmistakable scent of fear. There were too many eyes on them now, too many questions, and too much evidence. Principal Ramsey moved through the escalating chaos with quiet precision. He avoided the press, gave no interviews. He just continued the work, documenting, listening, and compiling every memo, every ignored complaint, every piece of a pattern that connected one incident to the next. He had become more than just careful. He was deliberate. Every word he spoke was chosen. Every meeting he held was documented. And Kira, despite the whirlwind of attention, maintained her routine. She arrived on time. She did her work. She walked the halls without ceremony. Her silence, once seen as a weakness, had transformed into a source of undeniable authority. Then came the moment of truth they could no longer bury. On a drizzly Monday morning, the district quietly released the initial findings of its review. There was no press conference, just a formal summary emailed to all parents and staff. The subject line read, "Preliminary Review Update." The email contained 7 paragraphs of bureaucratic language, but only one sentence truly mattered. "We have confirmed that multiple prior complaints involving the same group of students were not investigated or escalated through the proper channels. Corrective action is forthcoming." That single sentence was a detonation. Within hours, Nate's name was trending on local social media. Someone leaked the raw cafeteria footage to a student-run news account, and from there, it exploded. It was shared, reposted, and analyzed frame by frame. The moment Ethan threw the fork, the mocking laughter, the taunt, the silence, the stare. What happened next, no one could have predicted. It came not from Kira, but from within the boy's own social circles. A sophomore girl posted a long, detailed account of how Liam had harassed her during orientation week. She had reported it and been told she was likely misinterpreting his behavior. She had saved the dean's email. She posted the screenshots. A former student, now in college, commented on the video. "That's the same boy who followed me to my car after school 3 times. Nothing was ever done." The thread grew, the tone shifted, and then came the final, unavoidable reckoning. That Thursday, at a quiet district hearing that was not intended for the public, both Kira and Principal Ramsey were invited to speak, not just about the incident, but about the culture that had enabled it. She was hesitant at first, telling Ramsey it would just be for show, that nothing would really change. But he didn't try to sell her on hope. He gave her history. "Sometimes," he said, as they sat in his office watching the news headlines refresh on his computer, "they don't change because of a speech. They change because they run out of ways to lie." So she went. The hearing was in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room in the district building, the kind of place designed to make big things feel small. But the room was packed. Parents, teachers, community members, and a few reporters who had managed to get past the front desk. Kira stood at the front in a simple black sweater. She had no notes, no script. She did not raise her voice. She did not ask for pity. She told them what happened to her. She told them what had happened before that. And when a board member asked her, "Do you feel that justice has been served?" she answered without a trace of hesitation, "I don't need justice to be fast. I need it to be complete. And not just for me." A long, uncomfortable silence followed her words, but this time no one dared to interrupt it. Later that afternoon, a formal letter outlining disciplinary action against Nate, Liam, and Ethan was issued. It used words like harassment, targeted misconduct, and gross administrative negligence. The letter was not made public, but by then it didn't need to be. The silence that had once protected them had finally been broken. By Friday, Nate had officially withdrawn from the school. Liam's parents had submitted a transfer request. Ethan remained, but he now walked the halls with his head down, his posture deflated, the arrogance gone, replaced by the heavy weight of consequence. He never looked at Kira. She never had to say another word to him. He already knew, and so did everyone else. The school was different, not because the bricks had changed, but because the illusion had been shattered. The hallways still echoed, the bell still rang, but the silence had lost its power. There were still those who looked at Kira with suspicion, still teachers who spoke to her with a strained formality, but none of them looked at her with the same certainty they once had. The assumption that she would stay quiet, that she would absorb the pain, that she would eventually disappear, was gone. In its place was a question no one could avoid any longer. What would she do next? It was during 5th period on a Wednesday, under a sky heavy with the promise of rain, that Principal Ramsey asked to see her again. The message was quiet, delivered by a student aide on a neatly folded piece of paper. She walked to his office with the same measured, self-contained calm she now carried with her everywhere. He gestured for her to sit. This time his desk was clear. No files, no reports, no emails on the screen, just him, his hands folded. A stillness in his expression that told her this meeting was not about procedure. "I received a call this morning from the superintendent," he began slowly. "They finalized the external review. The board is meeting tomorrow to discuss the recommendations. A public statement will follow. She nodded once, waiting. They are going to issue a formal public apology, he continued. And to you, in writing. Kira blinked, but not with surprise. And he added, they are offering you the opportunity to speak at the press conference, just for a few minutes. It's entirely your decision. She leaned back in her chair, thoughtful, not defensive. They think if I speak, it will make all of this go away. No, Ramsey said. They think if you speak, it will make them look like they care. Her eyes, steady and sharp, met his. And what do you think? He paused, giving her answer the weight it deserved. I think this is your story now, all of it. The narrative, the voice, the outcome. You've been in control of it for longer than they realize. But speaking now in public, that makes it official. That makes it yours out in the open. She considered this for a moment, not for the sake of pride or revenge, but for the sake of clarity. What happens if I say no? They will still issue the apology, he said. They will still update their policies. They will still hold mandatory training sessions and promise to do better. But eventually it will fade. A new story will replace it, she nodded slowly. And if I do speak, then it doesn't fade. Then it is recorded in your voice. Then it becomes a part of this school's permanent record. She glanced out the window, where raindrops had begun to trace slow paths down the glass. Outside, students were crossing the courtyard, their umbrellas like small dark shields against the weather. She watched their easy, unburdened movements, but she felt no bitterness. She felt ready. I'll speak, she said finally. Ramsey gave a quiet nod. I thought you might. But the press conference was not the only thing on her mind. There was one last conversation to be had, one final piece of the story that needed to be put in its place. Ethan. He had not spoken a word to her since the disciplinary notice had been issued. Nate and Liam were gone, spirited away by their families behind a wall of lawyers and silence, but Ethan had stayed. He moved through the school like a phantom now, his boisterous energy replaced by a cautious, hunted awareness. His swagger was gone. She found him after school in the student parking lot. He was leaning against his car, head down, earbuds in. He didn't see her approach until her shadow fell over him. He looked up, and the fear in his eyes was immediate, but she held up a hand. I'm not here to fight, she said quietly. He didn't reply. She stood before him, letting the silence stretch, waiting until he was forced to look at her, not as a threat, but as a person. Do you ever think about why you did it? She asked. His brow creased. Did what? She tilted her head slightly. The hair, the jokes, the laughter. What was it all for? He swallowed hard. It was just a joke, she nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. You thought you had permission, he blinked. I didn't. You did, she cut in, her voice soft but firm. You thought nothing would happen. You thought I would just take it. You thought someone like me didn't have a right to her own dignity. Ethan remained silent. I don't need an apology, she added. I'm not here for one. I just wanted you to understand something. He shifted uncomfortably. You didn't break me, she said. You just revealed who you are. And with that she turned and walked away. She did not look back. She didn't need to. The press conference was held in the school auditorium, neutral ground. The first 6 rows were reserved for the press and the school board. Camera crews had set up early, their lights casting a harsh glare on the stage, their cables snaking across the floor. Outside, reporters delivered their stand-ups in clipped formal tones. Inside, the air hummed with a tense, polite energy. Principal Ramsey stood to the side of the stage, his sleeves rolled up, his tie slightly loosened. He looked exactly the same as he had the first day she'd met him in his office. The same quiet readiness, the same deep understanding that true power is rarely loud. Kira waited behind the curtain with Zara Hayes, the journalist who had first shared her story. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The superintendent spoke first, reading from a prepared statement filled with words like reevaluation and accountability. Her voice was composed, her regret professionally packaged. The applause was sparse and obligatory. Then Ramsey stepped to the microphone, not to give a speech, but to introduce Kira. His words were simple. She did not ask for a podium. She did not ask for cameras. But she earned them. Then he stepped away. Kira walked out slowly, her shoes making no sound on the stage. She wore a simple black blazer and a white blouse, her hair pulled back, her expression calm and steady. She stood behind the microphone but didn't touch it at first, her eyes scanning the crowd, taking in the sea of expectant, curious, and suspicious faces. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it filled the entire room. "My name is Kira Morrison." No flashbulbs went off. The room was utterly still. I didn't come here to recount what happened to me. That story has been told, repeated, and analyzed. You have all seen the video. You have read the articles. You have made your judgments. I came here to tell you what that moment meant and what it did not mean. She paused, letting the silence settle. It did not mean I was violent. It did not mean I was unstable. It did not mean I was a danger. It meant that I was tired. Tired of being quietly humiliated. Tired of pretending that my silence was a form of strength. Tired of being expected to absorb the insults, carry the weight, and never complain, all because I did not fit the mold of what this place was comfortable with. The only sound was the soft click of cameras. They cut my hair, but they did not break my spirit. They laughed, but they did not win. And when I stood up, not just in that classroom, but every day after, I wasn't just standing for myself. I was standing for every student who has ever been told that they were too much, too loud, too different, too black. I stood because I knew that no one else was going to stand for me. Her words flowed, even and measured, each one a deliberate step on a long road. They did not expect me to fight back. Not because they thought I was weak, but because they believed I wouldn't be allowed to. They assumed the system would protect them, just as it always had. And for a time it did, until it didn't. The stillness in the room was now a heavy breathing thing. Reporters had stopped typing. Phones were lowered. Kira leaned slightly closer to the microphone, her voice dropping, drawing everyone in. "I do not want your pity. I do not want to be your symbol. What I want is accountability that does not wait for an injury. What I want is a sense of safety that doesn't depend on who is watching. What I want is a school where dignity is not something you have to earn by being quiet, but something you are given because you are human." Another pause. This one for breath. I have been asked what I want now, what justice looks like. I don't have a single answer for that. But I can tell you what I don't want. I don't want apologies that aren't followed by action. I don't want promises that are forgotten in a week. And I don't want to be the last one who has to go through this. She exhaled slowly. "This place can be better," she said. "If it chooses to be." She stepped back from the microphone, not with a flourish or a bow, but with the same quiet strength that had carried her through everything. She didn't need their applause. She had already taken what they tried to steal from her and woven it into something unbreakable. There was silence at first. Then a single person began to clap. Then another. Then the entire room rose to its feet, not with wild cheers, but with a deep, sustained wave of respect. It was the sound of a truth that could no longer be denied. Kira walked off the stage, past the lights, past the cameras, past the faces that had once refused to see her. She was done being invisible. The days after the press conference were quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of avoidance or judgment, but the stillness that follows a storm after the foundations of a place have been shaken, and everything must be rebuilt. The school did not change overnight, but the air inside it had shifted. For the first time, people truly saw her. Some still looked away, but others offered small nods, quiet gestures of recognition. The district acted swiftly. New policies on racial bias and student dignity were drafted and implemented. An anonymous reporting system was created, monitored by an outside group. Principal Ramsey was formally commended, a gesture he barely acknowledged. His work was never about accolades. He and Kira passed in the hall a week later. "Well done," was all he said. She nodded. It was enough. The school board's final report used the word failure. It acknowledged the pattern and the harm. And while it could not erase the past, it created a record, a scar that would forever be visible. Austin transferred 2 weeks later. His absence was a quiet shift in the school's unspoken power dynamics. It was never about their punishment. It was about her presence. about the way she could now walk into the cafeteria and not feel her shoulders tense, about the way students now looked up when she spoke, not with fear but with respect. She had become a permanent part of the school story. One afternoon, a young girl stopped her in the hall. "You're Kira, right?" she asked, her voice small. "Yeah," the girl nodded. "Thank you for what you did. They used to bother my cousin all the time." "They don't anymore." Kira just smiled, a small, tired but genuine smile, and continued on her way. At home, things were changing too. Her mother sat with her one evening and simply said, "We're proud of you." The words were a quiet warmth, a mending of something that had been broken for a long time. She returned to the boxing gym where her cousin Marco trained. The air smelled of sweat and determination. He watched her wrap her hands, her movements slower now, more deliberate. He tossed her a pair of gloves. "Ready?" She stepped into the ring. I never stopped. They sparred in silence, a rhythm of motion and strength. Between rounds she leaned against the ropes, her breathing even. "You didn't swing too early," Marco said, his eyes steady on hers. "You waited. And then you finished it," Kira nodded. "And now?" he asked. She looked past him, to the world beyond the gym. "Now I teach someone else how," he smiled, a look of deep, quiet satisfaction. "You finally get it," he said. She didn't need to reply. The last weeks of the semester drifted by. Ayana no longer felt like she was surviving the school. She was a part of it. A student accountability committee had formed unofficially, but they were there, watching, listening. She saw Principal Ramsey less often, but their shared understanding was a silent, solid thing. The work was just beginning, but it had begun. On one of the last days, she sat in the cafeteria, not in the shadows, but near the center. A new student, a shy girl with dark, uncertain eyes, looked for a place to sit. Kira caught her eye and gestured to the empty chair beside her. "You can sit here," she said. The girl paused, surprised, and then she sat. They didn't talk much, but they shared the space, a space that had once been a battleground and was now, finally, just a place to eat lunch. Later that day, as she walked out of the building for the summer, she paused under the school's motto, "Unity in Achievement." For the first time, it didn't feel like a lie, not because the school had earned it, but because she had. That night in her room, she found the old severed braid tucked inside a journal. She held it for a long moment, not with pain, but with a kind of reverence. Then she placed it in a small box, closed the lid, and put it on the highest shelf of her closet. It was not something to be hidden, but something to be remembered, a testament to the person she had become when they tried to take a piece of her away. She didn't need a monument. She had become one.